All right, everyone. I'm Karen Tongson. As all of you are filing in to our Zoom room here, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this book launch, book event, book talk. Whatever the Zoom room book gathering, whatever we want to call it. Uh, on behalf of and in honor of these three amazing new books in game studies coming out of NYU Press. Um, Two of them are in Henry Jenkins and my series, Postmillennial Pop at NYU Press. We've been going strong since 2013, and we've over 20 titles in our series now at this point, and we're so thrilled that we have game studies titles coming in now through the pipeline, and especially these two amazing books from Chris and Tara in here, as well as Amanda's book as our intimate partner in game studies at NYU Press. I'm going to introduce all of the speakers very briefly. And then what's going to happen is that each of the speakers is going to give a little brief uh, overview of the project. I'm going to ask them a prompt and they're going to do that. And then that will be followed with a kind of Q&A round robin session with Henry, at which point we'll kind of wrap from there and do an audience Q&A. So be poised and ready to, and you can actually enter questions into the chat while we're going about the other parts of this program. So the speakers that we have today are Tara Fickle, who is Associate Professor of English at the University of Oregon and affiliated faculty with the Departments of Ethnic Studies and the New Media and Culture Certificate, as well as the Center for the Study of Women in Society and the Center for Asia Pacific Studies. Tara is very busy. Is it Tara or Tara? Tara.
Thanks.
Tara?
It's Tara. Yes.
Okay, good. Oh, good. I guess correctly. I have friends who are Taras and Taras who have very strong feelings about it. Tara's very busy at the University of Oregon. She received her PhD from UCLA and her BA from Wesleyan University. Her book that we're going to be talking about today, The Race Card From Gaming Technologies to Model Minorities, explores how games have been used to establish and combat Asian and Asian American racial stereotypes. And please visit Tara's website at tarafickle.com for more information about all of the many things that Tara is involved in and the work that she does. Our other speakers are Christopher B. Patterson, who received his PhD from the University of Washington. He's an assistant professor in the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia, where he teaches and researches trans-Pacific discourses of literature, video games, and new media, particularly through the lens of empire studies, Asian American studies, and queer theory. His first book, Transitive Cultures, was published by Rutgers in 2018 and actually won the ASA's 2020 Shelley Fisher Fishkin Prize for International Scholarship in Transnational American Studies. The book we're going to be talking about today, though, is his very recent new book, Open World Empire, Race, Erotics, and the Global Rise of Video Games, published in our series in April 2020 at NYU Press. He's published numerous articles all over the place. I invite you to look them up. And his second novel, All Flowers Bloom, was published by Westphalia Press in March 2020. So please do check into Christopher's public scholarship, his fiction writing, and as well as his podcast, New Books in Asian American Studies, that he's co hosting, along with a number of other projects. And last but certainly not least is Amanda Phillips, Assistant Professor of English and Film and Media Studies at Georgetown University and affiliate faculty in the American Studies program. They're the author of Gamer Trouble, Feminist Confrontations in Digital Culture, the book that we're going to be talking about today, and co-editor of the Queerness and Video Games special issue of Game Studies. So for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to check both of those things out, please do. You can find their other work in Games and Culture, Feminist Media Histories, Debates in the Digital Humanities, and more. And so without further ado, I want to get us into the meat of this program by beginning with a question as a bit of a prompt for you to all talk about your projects of what inspired you to do this particular work and how did that kind of open your approach to video games. You want to start with Tara?
Yeah, absolutely. So I also want to just say thank you so much, Karen, for that lovely introduction. And thanks to everyone who's here for taking the time out of your day, especially during this really hectic moment to attend. And I also wanted to thank the people at NYU and at USC who made this possible. So Amanda Ford, Megan Madden, Sydney Garcia, Sarah Bode. And it's really exciting to be able to discuss this book with both our series editors and two colleagues whose work I admire so much. So let me just start by very briefly running through a kind of schematic organization of the book to scaffold my later comments about inspiration. I think it'll make a little more sense that way. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick with a few slides. And can everyone see that okay? It's just a picture of the book cover right now. Great, thanks. So let me just shoot through the table of contents pretty quickly to say something about how the chapters are organized. So the chapters of the book are organized chronologically and also then paired thematically through the logic of a six-sided die, which, as you all know, probably as a rule has opposing sides that add up to 7. So the first pair of chapters, 1 and 6, I'm talking about the long history of using game rhetoric, by which I mean game metaphors, game images, game logic, to vilify and exclude Chinese immigrants on the basis of their cheap play. So first in the late 19th century through gold mining operations, and then later as 21st century digital laborers called gold farmers in the game World of Warcraft. And then chapters 2 and 5 in turn examine the mid-20th century game discourses about, and then later the game theoretical logic underlying, the 21st century traces of World War II and the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, through the game theoretical logic underlying Japanese American incarceration narratives, and then the atomic history underlying the Japanese Pokemon franchise. And then finally, chapters 3 and 4 function as the bridge that connect the two parts of the book, revising our understanding of, in chapter 3, the foundational narratives that have become the bedrock of Asian American studies, and then in chapter 4, game studies, respectively. So namely the emergence of the model minority, and then the Orientalist underpinnings to theories of play that inform modern game studies. So now that you have a sense of what the book looks like, let me just say a little bit about where it came from. The literal inspiration came from Amy Tan's novel, The Droyluk Club, which might surprise some because it is widely agreed in Asian American studies and probably presumed in literary studies too, that The Droyluk Club is a wholly contentless, overly palatable book that is the antithesis of some of the rigorous political work that we do as scholars. But at the end of the day, it's all about games. In fact, the book itself is structurally organized as a game of mahjong, as you're probably familiar with if you read the book or seen the movie, between the 4 mothers and daughters. And the way that it discussed Asian immigration to the States as this high risk, high reward game of chance and strategy was kind of a light bulb moment for me. So it got me thinking, wait a minute, this isn't at all like the model minority fantasy of how Asian Americans embody slow, steady accumulation and social mobility through some kind of peerless work ethic or allergy to fun. And it also made me realize that I had seen these ideas of games and these presentations of games, or what I'm calling the ludic, before. So in Woman Warrior and No No Boy and all these other acknowledged kind of classics, the canon of Asian American literature that aren't ever talked about in terms of their games. And it's something I'd seen in my own life too, in the Chinese culture that I grew up in. So that's why that first half of the book, the first 3 chapters, they're very much grounded in games from a kind of analog conceptual perspective. I'm interested in how games can help us think through Asian American literature and Asian American politics differently. Because I think there's a way that gaming and gambling and the relationship between those two, which I think is interesting in itself, not only creates a more honest picture of Asian Americans and the way we play, but it's also a method of challenging these kind of reductive stereotypes about Asians as robotic, unplayful, uncreative, rule-abiding, risk-averse, work-obsessed, which have shaped not just attitudes about individuals, but through my research, I was surprised to find their influence on really major milestones in Asian American history, and subtly shaping these legal decisions like immigration exclusion and Japanese American incarceration. And as we're seeing now, really extending to the tenor of contemporary geopolitics too. So in US-China relations right now, and let's say characterizations of China as a rule breaker or a cheater against whom fair competition is impossible. And then the second half of the book, to speak to that inspiration, which the second half is really about video games in the field of game studies, was inspired by a different kind of personal experience. So I grew up in California in the 1980s, just as the Nintendo first entered the North American scene. And I was introduced to it, perhaps also surprisingly, not by friends, but by my father. So Mario and Contra and Marble Madness came first, and then on the computer, Zork and King's Quest and Doom. And so video games are just a really constant feature of my childhood. And while, my parents and my grandmother always referred to it as, playing on the computer, they weren't particularly hostile to it. They didn't sort of call it a waste of time. And that actually really meant something. But I'd say around, sixth grade or so, the gendered and, in retrospect, really racialized expectations really kicked in. And nobody said anything explicitly, but it really kind of just felt like games weren't really for me anymore. The girls in my class, were doing other things, and the games themselves just didn't kind of speak to me in the same way anymore. So the games that I talk about in the second half of this book, specifically World of Warcraft and Pokemon Go, were really the games that kind of brought me back to gaming after this longer hiatus. Perhaps with Warcraft especially, maybe a little too deeply in terms of the time and really the work that kind of game requires. So it's the interplay between those two parts of the book that really kind of reflect its journey, but also really its central concern, which is how games shape and are shaped by Asian, or to use a term that Chris and I have been using more in our discussions lately, Asiatic experience. And so the technical name that I give to describe that dynamic in the book is Ludo-Orientalism. And if Ed is here, Ed Chang, I also wanted to give him a shout out because it's through a conversation with him that term really sort of started to hone itself. So just to say a little bit about that term, the term ludo or ludic, by the way, comes from that Latin word ludus, which has been used variously to mean sport, games, play, various kinds of training. And I use it in the book as a way to build on Edward Said's paradigmatic concept of Orientalism, specifically the images and the narrative used, the epistemes, like the sociologics through which the quote unquote West has defined the quote unquote East. And also defined itself against the East. So Ludo-Orientalism in the book describes first how games function as nation-building discourses, which define this quote-unquote East and West in relation not only to one another, but in opposing relation to these abstract game ideals of fairness and freedom, generally, but not always associating the West with them and the East as their antithesis. But I also use this term to show how those global dynamics are inextricable from their Eurocentric racialization. In other words, the East not only as this spatial and cultural non-Western entity, but also as a non-white other. So Ludo-Orientalism also describes how games function as racializing discourses that make Asian difference meaningful, that racialize it by characterizing it in gaming terms. And that Asian and Asian American artists, activists, and game designers also play with and at times subvert. And by artists, I mean both fiction writers in the first half, like the creators of Asian American literature I've talked about, as well as visual artists. So for example, as a comment on the war in Syria, the Aleppo-born photographer Coletta Keel produced this series using images from the game Pokemon Go. And what I think this work highlights really beautifully is how the mechanics of Pokemon Go, like so many other games, are all about collection and domination. This is a point that Henry made very forcefully early on and has been really influential to me. So in other words, not only does this art bring home how much a game like Pokemon Go resembles these older kind of world domination games you may be familiar with. So for example, a game like Risk, but it also renders visible the continuity with contemporary wars. In fact, US military personnel, as you may have heard about, played Pokemon Go incessantly and everywhere, so much so that they had to be banned from playing it on base. And so that's part of what makes images like Akil's, but also games like Pokemon Go so compelling to me. That dissonance that's created by superimposing these brightly colored, adorable, harmless little game characters against these brutal images of suffering and devastation as a product of imperialist and extremist violence. And that's what games create and maintain for me, that illusion of dissonance, the perception that these two things the pocket monster and the militant, the game world and the real world are completely different, are antithetical, rather than mutually constitutive. Because that ultimately, I think, is the myth that this book wants to topple above all. And it's a through line through both analog and digital explorations in the book, that games are not these innocent, apolitical, colorblind escapes that they may appear to be. And instead that they've actively shaped and supported the way that Americans think about race, progress, and inequality for over a century. And in order to recognize that, just to close by way of saying something about methodology, it's been really important for me to take an additional step beyond challenging games at the level of visual representation. And this is something I feel in very good company with my colleagues about. So going beyond, the characters and stereotypes produced in video games, let's say, or the number of skin shades that are available for avatars. These kinds of representations are certainly ripe for and absolutely in need of critique. But I'm interested in thinking about how the kind of overt signs of race and gender, let's say, which constitute or historically constituted the horizons of video game critique, can also be understood as epiphenomenal on-screen symptoms of the more entrenched social fictions that are encoded within, or as Amanda puts it, really baked into the games. So I was interested in this book in really extending our purview of games and play below the surface and focusing on racialization and on games as kind of self-making and other-making technologies through some of the ways that I've discussed. It's by defining games as technologies, as I do in the title, that transform an imagined fiction into a social reality, that the race card helps explain how forms of human difference, whether racial hierarchies or international conflicts, are made to feel not only real, but justified in the contemporary epoch. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara. I guess we have up next, Chris. Do you want to get started on that? And please feel free. I want to say, if anyone had any questions from Tara's presentation, please feel free to include them in the chat window, and we'll try to get to them when we do the audience Q&A after the main segment. So, Chris, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Thanks, Karen. It's great to see so many awesome people here I've known throughout the years, and many of whom have been very crucial to helping me understand game studies. Ed Chang, of course, like what Tara said, has been kind of foundational for a lot of us. Thank you, Karen. It's interesting hearing your voice being on this. I feel like I'm on your podcast right now, so it's pretty cool. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm currently settling in upon the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. And I'm also an American immigrant and anti-racist educator. And I stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter protesters and owe much of my professional career, as many of us do, to Black studies and Black feminist scholarship. I also want to thank all the folks who helped organize the talk: Amanda, Tara, Karen, and Henry, as well as the good people at NYU Press, the Asian Canadian Asian Migration Program at UBC, my department, the Social Justice Institute, which supports me, gives me money sometimes, and of course my partner, Idang Trung, and my in-laws, who together make everything I do possible. So I was thinking of Karen's question about how this book got written and how it relates kind of to our personal lives. And so that question was very easy to answer, as Karen was pointing out with my first book, Transitive Cultures, because that book investigates histories and migration patterns very similar to my family's history, coming from Philippines to Hawaii, and then to the mainland United States. But this book, Open World Empire, is about digital technology and video games, so it's a bit tougher of a question to answer. But I wanted to try and answer anyways, and I've tried to write about it in other contexts as well. So I kind of settled on being mixed race, brown, Asian, American, and male. And given the racial logics that keep Asian men from, at least in a kind of high school, elementary school setting, from being good at sports, or that keep brown men from being good at school, or that keep both from popularity or masculinity, video games for me were the only space growing up where I was naturally cast as the winner. People just saw me and was like, "Oh, you must be good at video games." And I never really thought too much about that. I just oh, this is it. This is what I should do. And even today, I noticed as a scholar who got my PhD in literature and who does Southeast Asian studies, I feel like all those discourses have been kind of like they have a lot of gatekeepers who see me and don't like what I'm doing. Whereas when game studies folks see me, I almost like the stamp of my identity gives me an instant kind of into that gateway, which I know a lot of other people experience the opposite in game studies, right? Whereas I feel like I have a lot of privilege just kind of being able to step in. And so I'm not sure why that is. And I wanted to kind of, well, I know why that is, but I wanted to try to explore that a bit. So here I'll share some thoughts on my subject position as a kind of documentation of a personal archive. So first, as an American male, I feel subject to the exploitative violence of information technology that games circulate as forms of, and mask as forms of male camaraderie. So growing up, playing games boosted me and sent me flying into the heights of technological design, made me feel powerful, gave me a kind of masculinity routed through American military domination. And so my book claims that games made me feel this way because they are products of a trans-Pacific empire, and likewise, they render and refract the racial, sexual, gendered, and national logics of empire today, including the logics that have defined me and those like me. Second, as an Asian and brown person, Filipino heritage, video games continue to provide a media where I have an access and knowledge presumed as natural and authenticating, but one that also stamps my identity with a techno-orientalist ink as a person who is one with the mechanical apparatus. So recognizing this has helped me understand how video games are tethered to Asia. Its hardware, and this is kind of repeating a bit of what Tara said, but as its hardware is assembled in Asia, its most talented esports players are of Asian origin. Japanese companies like Nintendo, Sony, and Sega have defined and dominated the medium. And as with my own stamp of gameplay expertise, video games draw on established discourses of Asia to provide what I call an Asiatic space, similar to yoga, tea drinking, and meditation, a kind of playful sphere of racial otherness that straddles notions of the queer, the exotic, the bizarre, and the erotic. So in my book, I define Asiatic as a style or form recognized as Asian-ish, but that remains adaptable, fluid, and outside of the inauthentic binary. And I got this term by just keeping up with a lot of game communities, and the question continued to arise whether characters in certain games were Asian or not. And I would notice that they would kind of defer to this term Asiatic to describe them without seeing the problems in that term either. And so I kind of sought to reclaim this term and to try and use it as through the kind of roots of like Colleen Lai and how she uses it as well. So following the book's political arguments, seeing games as Asiatic accounts for how games have facilitated imperialism in Asia through Cold War presumptions of technological ability, as in techno-orientalism, and labor availability by taking advantage of colonial era racial structures. For example, and Lisa Nakamura writes a lot about this in the context of microprocessing factories and things like that. So I call games Asiatic, not to reduce games into an East-West binary where all Western players are Orientalist, but to account for the inescapability of Asian associations in games and to trace their trans-Pacific imperial contexts. So confronting our attachments to an Asiatic commodity, I argue, can help unwedge the imperial attitudes within discourses of technology that see Asia as a place of manufacture and production, or as Tara was saying, as a kind of Ludo-Orientalism, and that's then see North America as a site of development and design. My own experiences with games have always been different in that case from those around me. Games were neither a form of entertainment nor were they educational. They were a kind of sensual and enigmatic daily practice. And I just encountered this with a friend who I've been playing Valorant with. I don't know why I'm playing that game, but it seems to always come out that I play it very, very differently, where I'm just kind of trying to have a lot of weird fun. And so I begin to think about that too. Like this was not merely tethered to my racial and gendered identity, but to kind of youth, sexuality, and personality. My own queerness, my own age when I played video games, including my queer love for the silly, the anarchic, the playful, the sensual, the tacky, the campy, and the erotic. This appears in Open World Empire as a methodological declaration that in order to comprehend, analyze, and interpret games as both art objects that express what I call the open world empire. And as Asiatic commodities, we have to be able to play them erotically. And so erotics is kind of the main method that I use throughout the book. And so my book claims that games are erotic in the ways that they encourage queer and playful attempts to misbehave. And I'm thinking of erotic through like Audre Lorde and Roland Barthes and people like that. As a light-skinned brown Asian man with a precarious youth and queer sensibilities, I have always been attracted to games because they allow me to lash out, to make trouble, as Amanda Phillips would say. Within every boundary, I feel the troublemaking desire to transgress that boundary, to leap down a stairwell, to break the game somehow. And of course, this is all in good fun until this starts to overlap with certain political events. And so in 2014, as we must obligatory talk about at some point, this kind of fanciful disobedience of game cultures combined with the male-dominated industries of information technology created a perfect storm, leading to #Gamergate, which according to some scholars helped produce much of the discursive norms and misogynist rhetoric that were later used in Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign to eliminate Hillary Clinton. Still not an uncontroversial statement, but there has been a lot written about this. Like any community formed through art, game culture, I see as functioning through what Partha Chatterjee calls a kind of political society that takes on no recognizable form by the state, but becomes politicized when the interests of the group inform a historical moment to the point that a political breach occurs and the group's members react with a political will that was always present, but at the time appears spontaneous, disorganized, and leaderless. So in misbehaving, gamers are not resisting a system, but often helping it thrive. A system that provides avatar personalities characterized by marginalization, alterity, and modes of resistance, where even the rich and powerful are made to feel like victims. And so Amanda's book talks quite a bit about this, as well as Soraya Murray's book. As a medium that sees not identities, but roles, not abstracted communities, but bodies that feel and play, I'm very interested in games because I think they allow us to rethink how our roles in the world have led us to do what we do and to write what we write. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And then, anchoring us in this first discussion section is Amanda Phillips.
All right. And I'll try to be brief because I'm really excited about getting to the conversation because there's so many rich resonances between all three of our projects. And I will say that sort of like being here in DC is a very strange kind of moment with all the sort of uprisings around what it means to be American. And I think it's just a really interesting time. And for me personally, Congressman John Lewis, right, whose sort of infamous encouragement of us to make good trouble was one of the things that sort of like fed into the book, right, or the concept of trouble for me. He is currently lying in state at the Capitol, just a few miles from my house. I think the ceremony is still going on right now, or at least it was about an hour ago. The timing of this is really interesting. For me, the trouble of gamer trouble actually starts with feelings, right? As a grad student, and I know various people in game studies have talked about this, some more publicly than others, and I saw Emma Vossen is here. The feeling that those of us who are doing this kind of cultural work in game studies are doing it wrong, right? That we're doing game studies wrong. It comes from a sense of doing theory wrong, which I think is something that we all struggle with in grad school and also even as like grown-ass academics doing our work. And for me, like being in trouble about theory has always been an anxiety that I carry with me everywhere. And finally, a sense that enjoying the kind of games that I enjoy is wrong, right? Or that in some way it means I'm doing feminism wrong or social justice wrong, or that the pleasures that I take in particular kinds of media are not great and will get me in trouble, right? So the trouble of gamers trouble starts with feelings that it then sort of like shifted into a methodology in itself. So like, what if I take all of these bad things and just kind of like put it in a blender with my best intentions and my best knowledge of theory and see what happens if I do game studies in sort of this way. So trouble came out as a genealogy, right? And so I mentioned John Lewis already as someone who's encouraging us to make good trouble for racial justice. But also in academia, of course, trouble we often trace back to Judith Butler, right? And gender trouble as a sort of like foundational queer theory text. And at the very least, a word that enters queer theory and has a certain meaning around gender and sexuality that was really meaningful for me. Then, of course, there's Donna Haraway's use of trouble, encouraging us to stay with the trouble. And finally, Sarah Ahmed is another thinker who's really central to the book and thinking about how do we cause trouble in our various social circles and also our academic disciplines, which leads me to trouble as a method, right? Gamer trouble is in part a citational experiment, and that's something that I explicitly state in the introduction, but I don't know whether people like actually get that reading the book, right? So the citation practices that I engage in are very intentional in terms of who is named and who is not named in the book, whose work I sort of affiliate myself with as a game studies scholar. And I mentioned there's a line in the introduction where I mentioned I'm going to ruffle the feathers of a few influential and beloved colleagues, right? And I think, and this comes from Sarah Ahmed, right? Citation practices are really important, not only for building a strong foundation for the theoretical work you're going to do, but also marking the sort of like communities that you see yourself in conversation with. Trouble as method is also going against received wisdom about particular games, right? So I have a chapter where I talk about Portal, which is often seen as the sort of like held up as one of the exemplars of feminist games. And then Bayonetta, that was at one time really held up as the example of an anti-feminist game. And sort of like switching our received wisdom about that and to sort of think about how the politics of both those games are actually way more complicated than any first reading can be. Trouble as method is also about embracing messiness and sort of, you know, as a person who exists at a lot of messy boundaries of identity, right? A sort of like queer masculine person, a mixed race person, a person who has all these sort of like messy identities. As a scholar, I think it's fitting for me to sort of like be situated at messy frontiers in scholarship. Game studies itself is a mess, right? Which is a declaration that Ian Bogos made about the discipline. Now, I intentionally use trouble instead of mess to ground my work in what I call queer and women of color feminism, and in the parentheses, right? But just to think about like how does my sense of moving from topic to topic, sort of thinking across how my reading practices sort of like read across games and across these structures, sometimes reaching into the depth, but like sort of how I read across is very messy. How I speak about this is very messy, and thinking about like embracing that. And finally, I set out to sort of trouble what I borrow, I think, from Alex Galloway as the gamic system, right? So thinking about, and this is very similar to what Tara was talking about, and we also see it in Chris's work, thinking about how to relate the surface phenomena of games to their depth. And for me, depth is about not only technological structures, not only about these sort of like ideological structures and politics, but then how do we then relate the microcosm to the macrocosm of sort of like global politics, global capitalism, and that sort of thing. Also sort of like blurring the boundaries between the gamer and the machine, right? So the other keyword in my title is gamer, right? Or the gamer in the system, I guess I should say. And in some ways it's a misnomer, because what I'm trying to do is take our sort of like overdetermined emphasis on the gamer as a subject, right? And zoom out and sort of show the ways in which gamers are actually not very much in control of anything. And they're all embedded within these systems of politics, of technology, of narrative, of et cetera. right? So these are all the sort of like troubling gestures that I'm trying to make. And just to sort of like give a brief description of the formal structure of the book, right? I take this sort of sequentially, right? I have a chapter that I generally call the discourse chapter, right? Which addresses harassment events in gamer culture, right? And of course, Gamergate is the one that everyone knows about now, but I actually situate my discussion of harassment in some earlier harassment events that were known as Dick Wolves and Fat Princess, right? Which were sort of other mass harassment events that didn't really reach the mainstream media's eye. But instead of centering this around a question of like gamers and gamer culture, I relate it to early academic discourse about Grand Theft Auto and thinking about the ways that the sort of struggle over world building around gaming and gamer identity that really, to me, boils down to, do you understand the object in the way that I understand the object? I see the same sort of forces playing out in academic conversations around video games where we want to make sure that you know the right way to read a game. And often this is around sort of like cultural political issues. So for Grand Theft Auto in particular, you see a protectionism that exists in game studies in general, but we want to sort of like protect the object of Grand Theft Auto from critics who would read it as racist or whatever, because they just don't understand how games work, right? And that's a literal defense. I have a lot of unflattering quotes that I pulled out in that chapter without actually citing people. So this is more sort of like intentional citational politics, but thinking about the ways that some folks actually like said this stuff, right? The second chapter is about representation, right? Or actually, no, it's about technology, but also representation, sort of like bleeding into that. And it's about facial recognition and facial customization softwares and how those are all like completely founded on sort of racial scientific logics out of the 19th century, right? Physiognomy and that sort of thing. So that's a fun exploration of the sort of like contemporary practices of motion capture animation, of sort of the way that we build digital models, and how, you know, our newest technologies almost always serve to reinvigorate these old ways of understanding race and gender. The third chapter, which I mentioned about Portal and Bayonetta, is this sort of like representation chapter where I take on Laura Mulvey's notion of the male gaze and also dig more into what it means to do feminism in game studies, right? Feminism is not a monolithic ideology. It's not a monolithic sort of like set of activist or theoretical practices. And there's a lot of disagreement over like what feminist means, particularly around games. So I was really interested in the conflict around feminism, around ideas of the male gaze, and how that plays out across Portal and Bayonetta. And then finally, we get to FemShep, or the female Commander Shepard of the Mass Effect series. And that becomes my chapter where I bring all of these layers together and try to read across these different registers in and around Mass Effect. And ultimately sort of argue for, or argue against our sort of like reliance and gaming's reliance on the sort of like heroic narrative, right? And where we end up with individualist actions for social justice, and how that doesn't cut it, right? And that's really easily co-opted by capitalism. So that's just a little bit about the structure of the book, and I think that's good. I think I'll leave it there for us to start our conversation.
Okay, so wonderful introductions to each of the books. My task is to ask some kind of overarching questions that will bring us some conversation between the authors. Again, with the idea we will end up with some questions from the audience. So if you want to post something in chat, we will definitely do our best to get to people. So each of these books might be considered a contribution to something which people are starting to call critical game studies. So I wondered how you would define critical game studies and your relationship to it, and what does critical game studies help us to understand about games and the larger context in which games operate that we wouldn't have gotten from, say, ludology or some of the earlier framings of what game studies was meant to explore. So who would like to start?
I'm happy to start unless Chris or Tara have. Okay. I mean, I think it's interesting in that we sort of have this understanding that this work is happening all of a sudden right now, when I think it's more a matter of where we're focusing our attention, right? And this is something that other scholars have said, right? I mean, Henry, you were there in the beginning, sort of like advocating for a critical take on games as well. And so I'd say that one of the things I try to do in Gamer Trouble is bring up that history, or in my citation practices, sort of like rewrite a game studies, or sort of like point to a game studies that is my foundational game studies, as opposed to the game studies that floats to the surface in other sorts of conversations. And I know there are lots of folks in this room who were either there, right, in the beginning also, but are also sort of like working directly with or off of the work of or the early sort of like critical work that was being done around games. So I want to sort of like refuse this image of like the pioneers of critical game studies, because it's work that people have been doing. And one of the things that is frustrating, I think, is when Gamergate happens, then all of a sudden everyone cares about marginalized people in gaming, right? So it takes this really violent harassment event to sort of like justify the things that we had been doing all along, right? What became Gamer Trouble was basically finished, I mean, in its like early dissertation form, right before Gamergate hit, right? And so it's sort of like this weird temporality of these projects, where like, okay, Gamergate makes the industry suddenly care about marginalized people. It makes like, you know, folks reading about video games suddenly care. But there are many of us doing the work before that as well.
Yeah, I'll kind of expand on that a bit. My coming into game studies was not exactly intentional in the same way. Like I was doing, well, Ed Chang kind of brought me into this game studies group at University of Washington as a graduate student. But then when I was writing my dissertation, there were, of course, like with everyone kind of gets while writing their dissertation, there are bouts of like depression and anxiety. And so I would just play a lot of games, and I was always interested in game studies. And so I'd read a lot of that, but I never really saw the way that I play games represented in game studies. So I never really thought it was that interesting, to be honest, until I started to read like Adrienne Shaw's work. She has they have a 2010 essay in was it Games and Culture, I think, which is still like the most widely read essay in that journal, about why there needs to be a kind of critical game studies or cultural studies of games. And I think one of the things that always kind of bothered me about game studies, which Rob Gallagher also writes quite a bit about, is that it's very anti-sex and anti-erotic. And so like, and Bernard Suits' the Grasshopper, which is very widely quoted, he talks about how games are not sex, they're like the opposite of sex, because in sex there's no winners or losers, and so all these kind of ridiculous things that he talks about. And so there seemed like this really weird desire to distinguish and distance games from sex and games from gambling, which is something that Tara's book also talks about. And so in both of that kind of division from gambling and sex, it was a way to kind of keep arcades open in a sense, I guess. But it's also kind of Orientalist and kind of racist, right, towards gaming cultures that play more erotically, or more, that's more part of the discourse, right, or where gaming is a kind of gambling. And so Tara and I both write about this in our books. And so the discourse of game studies, to me, always had this kind of racial component to it, in the way that, in the very beginning, from the way that they just defined what a game was. And then you kind of see it throughout its history, in the sense that talking about games as like, there are some certain perverse games out there that just don't get talked about. We're just not going to discuss those Japanese perverse games. And it's kind of a racist way of thinking about Japanese culture. And a lot of game writing, to me, has had this weird kind of responsive attitude of like, let's salvage what we like about Asian cultures and Japanese cultures especially, and distinguish that from all the stuff we don't like about Asian cultures, which is the perversity, the patriarchy, the racism, you know. And so there's a strange kind of like way of trying to intermix and hybridize with in a way that kind of passes as diversity. It's almost the opposite. And so those were the kind of the things I had coming into it. And then when I started to publish articles in critical game studies or critical cultural studies of games, I noticed that the two things that reviewers seemed to really dislike were, first of all, everything I just said about kind of game studies, but then second, trying to read games erotically and using queer theory to do that. For some reason, reviewers just kept pushing and pushing against that. And I would have to really argue and push my way into it until I realized that that was the argument that I needed for the book. And so the book basically just came about because so many people didn't like what I was doing in game studies. But there are also, of course, a great, like, I think critical game studies right now is kind of, I think Amanda talks about this as a kind of Laura Mulvey moment, right? In the sense that things have been shifting quite well. And there's a lot of syllabi going out there right now for what to read for that.
Not my phrase, but yeah, I mention it in the book.
And I'll just say a few things briefly about it. Just kind of underscore what's been said by Amanda about the fact that this work has been going on for a really long time. And it's interesting seeing in terms of disciplinary titles, the idea of sort of appending critical to game studies, I think performs a couple of different functions. And one is, you know, I also want to acknowledge the really impressive work that I have seen being done that I want to build on, but also it feels like a sort of second or even third wave of game studies at which it's a point to be critical of it and critical of the way that it's been done so far. For me, what Amanda was saying about some of the early critiques, let's say, or defending something like Grand Theft Auto against critique that's really interesting to me is the way in which games are kind of defined as, and this goes back to what Chris is saying, defined as non-critical spaces, spaces where you can't really call it racist or sexist because those terms somehow don't apply there. And so recuperating that by way of taking a critical look, not only at the games themselves, but at the long history of rhetoric that has been used to justify games as somehow outside of critique is something that I think critical game studies might be understood as partaking in.
So one of the orthodoxies of traditional game studies has been this idea of the magic circle. And I know each of you push back against that concept in one way or another in your writing. So how can we rethink the issues raised by the magic circle?
I can just start really briefly because
Sure.
I do one of the older takes on it. So in one of my chapters, you know, I look really closely at Johan Huizinga's way of formulating the magic circle. And he's, you know, one of the first in his book, Homo Ludens. And the idea of the magic circle, especially for those of you who might not be as familiar of it, as Huizinga defines it, is a border which is either material or metaphorical that somehow separates the game world, kind of protects it magically within it. From what's going on outside, in which different kinds of rules apply, the things that you can do within it would not necessarily be read the same way as things that are happening outside of it. For me, I think what's been most interesting and the contribution that I want to make in terms of the magic circle, which is, I think many people have also defined many different ways since then, is thinking about how steeped it is in an Orientalist sense of a binary between East and West, right? Sort of what inheres in one is sort of related in a kind of antithetical complementarity to the other. The one is defined by the other's lack and excess. And so for me, I think going back to the magic circle and looking at some of the texts that Huizinga was using to define what play is universally, was very much relying on early texts, especially Indian, Japanese, Chinese practices, often taken, you know, not through primary sources, but rather kind of secondary quasi-anthropological Orientalist texts, in which, you know, ideas about, let's say, Asian play were absolutely extreme. You know, either they, you know, one of the interesting arguments that I found is the way in which, on the one hand, this emphasis of Asians as so playful that they make everything into a game, right? So much so that courtesy itself becomes a game, right? Arguing over who's going to pay the bill, right? Or who's going to get, whatever other kind of courtesy game they're talking about, that he uses those as a way to kind of calibrate his definition of the magic circle was something of real interest to me.
I'll just step in just quickly to say that I agree with everything Tara said about it kind of having this Orientalist vibe, and the way it still gets talked about sometimes still has that. I was just reading Doreen Kondo's new book on world making, and I think she puts it really well, thinking about performance and how performance has this kind of, she hasn't used the word magic circle, but this kind of aura of magic to it. But at the same time, those in the audience can have these kind of racial affects in the way that they receive the work, in the way that everyone around them will be laughing at certain jokes, for example. And suddenly that magic is like lost and it turns into a kind of nightmare for them. And so that's one thing that I try to explore, not using those terms because I hadn't read that book yet. But yeah, and I feel like that there's a lot of terms in game studies that try to distance games from like everyday practices as if there's something really different. Immersion is a word I also don't really like to use for that reason. And so I think there's a kind of things that that I try to kind of let go of a bit in my book by kind of talking about them very briefly, and also practice like a kind of citational politics where I'm not, but Tara's book is a bit better at that because she does go really far into it.
Yeah, I really appreciated Tara's take on the magic circle because it is one of those concepts that feels kind of analyzed to death within the field of game studies, even though it retains a sort of like, I don't know, for me it captures a sort of like visceral rightness. And I know I don't think, and Eric Zimmerman wrote a piece about the magic circle jerk, right? Which, speaking of eroticizing games, and completely like not following it down that path, right? So in this article about the magic circle jerk, he sort of discusses the magic circle jerk who just runs in and says like games are totally separate from society, and that this figure is set up as a straw man for other people to come in and say like, well, actually, games are connected to real life in all sorts of important ways. And they are. And for me, I should say, that still doesn't mean that there's no sense of separation from the world when engaging in a game. And so for me, I'm interested in the ways in which, and I use the term the interface envelope, and I'm kicking myself because I'm very terrible with names, and now I can't remember the guy's name who wrote the book about the interface envelope. But I found it a really compelling way to think about how games are engineered to direct our attention in a particular way, right? They're not always successful. It's not always a seamless envelopment, but they are supposed to like capture our senses, capture our attention, capture our dollars in a particular way. And so I'm still compelled by that image of the thing that sort of holds us in a special place, even if sort of practically like that sealing away is never complete, right?
Well, if we think of games as interwoven with the world, what thoughts do you have about gaming in the age of COVID and Black Lives Matter and the 2020 presidential election? I mean, we're seeing lots of discussion out there of Animal Crossing as the game of the moment, although Overwatch seems to be competing with it. Do you have any thoughts, any of you, on what's going on as we speak?
I can step in, I guess, because Tara and I have actually been working on a small piece for a journal where we just try and, as we were writing it, it's a collaborative piece with some designers. COVID-19 occurred, and we didn't really know what to do to try and organize everyone to get together and have a roundtable discussions. And so the only way that we could motivate ourselves was to write about what was happening around us. And some indie game designers like Mike Rin E and Angela He came up with some pretty brilliant games about COVID-19 that I think one important thing to keep in mind that whenever these kind of crises happen, as Amanda was alluding to, that this is an industry, and our job as game scholars, I think, because so many game scholars are interested in this, but our job is not to just be there for the industry and just to say why games are great. And I say that kind of a bit bitterly now because I'm getting a lot of reviews for journal articles where that seems to be the main argument, that the industry needs to grow, it needs to be better, and so on. And I find that that's still kind of there's a kind of fidelity to the industry in a lot of game studies work that I think we should be very suspicious of. But the games industry is kind of, as a lot of folks point out, is it almost relies on crises like COVID-19 and even Black Lives Matter protests because their sales end up just going up. And they're, like Amanda was alluding to, they're actually not very good at actually promoting diversity in any way, but somehow they're very convincing to a lot of people who play games, who will just kind of seem to be like they don't want to feel guilty for playing a game, and so almost anything a game industry or company says, they will just kind of buy it and go with the flow in a way. And so I feel like that on one hand, what's happening now with Black Lives Matter protests and global rebellion, we could start to come out with work, or we'll probably start to see work that will do similar to what like the discourses before Trump's election. They'll start to see, a lot of these protests were because of these game cultures, right? Because Overwatch had all these new rules about how to discuss things in chat. Suddenly, this was able to produce, these protests in some way. And so I think we should again kind of keep being there to kind of be a bit more critical of those studies that are going to, I think, that come out or are on their way to coming out. Even though like playing games can be almost a heroic act right now because it means you're not leaving the house and so on. I think this is like a very crucial time for critical game studies scholars to start to turn against the industry and really try to point out all of the kind of hypocrisies that are going on in moments like these when they're trying to exploit and take advantage, because their sales never drop, when film and all these other industries do, and they're reliant on us not criticizing them enough for it.
And they're also reliant on particular labor practices that are just heinous, right? And will only be amplified because of this crisis, right? So their sales may not drop, but there's still an employment crisis happening in the games industry right now, which is something that, there are people who are working on this, but it's certainly the labor situation in the games industry is abhorrent, and we need to shine more of a light on that. My other answer to that question is turns more personal, right? So in talking about the ways that games are supposed to corral our attention, and sort of thinking about what Chris said about the sort of depressive moments of grad study where you kind of disappear into a game for hours at a time. Sometimes playing Animal Crossing is the only thing I can get done in a day, right? Where we're in such a tense moment, and where all of our routines are really disrupted, that that's what I'm I'm doing with my time. I'm not writing, I'm not reading, I'm planting flowers, or also I play The Binding of Isaac a lot as well, but it's something that stimulates me and captures my attention in the way that nothing else can right now, either because it's too painful or because I cannot concentrate or whatever. But that's sort of where my brain is at, and what the games industry has been able to do with these products so successfully.
Yeah, and I so appreciate that kind of honesty. I think that we're all kind of in the same boat, but especially as academics, it becomes hard to admit or acknowledge that, and to have the privilege of doing so. I'll just say briefly that it's always fascinated me that pandemic and viruses have always been such a popular genre of game, and thinking about why that is, right? Whether you're talking about the actual game pandemic or the domination of the world by forces of some kind, whether viral or otherwise. And it's been really striking to me, as Chris was saying, the Verge piece that we're doing is looking at games like Novel Containment, which are indie takes, but are very interesting to me in that they really, I think, explore the potential of the simulation. For many of us, I think checking the statistics about how many new cases, how many new deaths, looking at the map, et cetera, has a very disturbing similarity to playing those kinds of pandemic games. And of course, the fact that anti-Asian racism and association with China as the locus of the virus feels especially uncanny and similar. One thing that I'll say very briefly in terms of Black Lives Matter protests and kind of global rebellion and games, it's been interesting to me to think more about what the potential for games really is in terms of empathy and consciousness building and organizing. I don't have too much to say on it because I'm still really kind of exploring it, but I'm curious about the potentials for technologies, especially VR and others that have been kind of touted as tools of, let's say, racial empathy building or immersion, of which I'm interested but skeptical for all the reasons that both Chris and Amanda have been talking about.
So go ahead.
Oh, so no, I was just going to also point towards the very wild outbreak of Black Lives Matter fundraisers through particularly indie game sales, although there were some corporate games that got swept up into that. And I found it on the one hand, like everybody's trying to do whatever they can to help. And so you're showing up with your skills and what you have at hand to aid in the movement. On the other hand, so like I saw one of the bundles had things like NBA 2K, right? And these games that are sort of like very much based in this commercial exploitation, but also in like anti-Black racism directly in a way. And so I find it fascinating that a lot of people like really, and I was one of them, right, who really like jumped on this bandwagon of really celebrating, get literally like 2,000 games for $5 to help the Black Lives Matter movement. And yet there was very little sort of curating of the game's content, right? It was almost like what the games were about or what they did or what they sort of promoted was immaterial to the money that they could bring to the movement.
Okay, sorry, since we're talking about that, can I just add one quick, for those of you who played League of Legends or just seen the front page, I was immediately struck in terms of what Amanda's talking about in terms of fundraising, how certain skins, and of course they're skins, right, are being sold to support COVID research and PPE efforts. And what they had released were two, Asiatic characters named Shen and Akali in nurse and doctor skins, so it seemed very much of a piece with the kind of ideological narratives that were happening, but also, as Amanda is saying, very much curated at the level of, surface rather than depth.
Well, we're going to turn to the audience questions in just a minute. Let me ask one more question of the panel, and then we'll start taking those questions. I see we're building up quite a few. The question is a methodological one. I think some of the debates in game studies over the last decade have centered over whether we can read games as a text or whether we need to think of them as a rule system, an event, a performance. There are various metaphors for thinking about what we're looking at. But what to characterize them is the factoring in of gaming and the gamer identity, gamer experiences as empirical experiences into the study of games. So how do you come down and how do you reckon balancing in critical game studies between the game itself and this other space of play? And what are the mechanisms for thinking about player identity, for example, as you're doing your work?
I mean, one of the frustrations I had sort of early in my career was butting up against the fact that I'm not an ethnographer. I have no training in ethnography, and yet there was always an expectation that if you're talking about video games, you need to be talking about what players are actually doing, right? As someone who was trained in an English program, it's a little bit, I mean, it's not part of my training. It's not part of what we assume is the value of a text, or even the value of talking about or looking at or analyzing a text. It was not lost on me that the vast majority of work, particularly around gender and feminist game studies, the early work is all sort of social science-based methodologies, right? Ethnographies of players or of game designers, and that sort of thing. And so that was a little bit of a struggle to sort of like validate my own approaches, I guess, to this content in this way. And also struggling with like, what does interdisciplinarity mean, right? We are all trying to develop expertise. And I think that something like expertise is necessary to do justice to a body of work. So I can say, you know, yeah, I'm an expert in queer theory and in feminist studies and in literary studies, but like, is that seen as interdisciplinarity in the way that like it would be seen if I were an anthropologist and a literary scholar, right? So I think there's an interesting way in which the humanities disciplines are sort of like assumed to be a lump together, or all one discipline, where yeah. And I think it takes just as much work to kind of like master queer theory as it does to master something like ethnography.
I'll just real quick say that I talk about this a bit in the book as being almost like having to choose between like Democrat or Republican in a way. That like it's kind of a false choice, and it's kind of a trap to choose either one in a sense, depending on what because they're so similar actually in so many ways. I feel like those debates were just kind of mired in like certain ideas about what games were, about, you know, player agency, about immersion and things like that. And they're both kind of a bit antithetical to what I try to do in the book. And so like even you know, Hamlet on the Holodeck has moments, and in other reiterations of this book where the introduction is like rewritten, there are moments where Murray will go off about like the postmodern scholars and how they are like, you know, that it's not real work and doesn't belong in game studies. It's not positivistic enough, and instead phenomenology is where it's all at. So there's moments where like, oh, I really can't deal with this, and the ludologists are like a bit not so interesting either. And so I think what I try to do in the book is think about erotics as a kind of way to play across different genres. And so every chapter of my book is kind of about a different genre, and how erotics as a method can kind of, you know, because it's focused on the impacts of the body. And I use like Twitch streamers and things like that to try and understand the kind of, to try and understand that. My thinking more recently has been to kind of focus on particular genres and methods. And so like I was reading the Doreen Kondo book because I'm using a kind of performance theoretical framework, which other people have done. Takia Rivera has done this as well, to look at games. But I think it's really interesting to use performance theory to look at visual novels, especially. And I don't think I would use the same methods to think about other genres of games. And so I think having kind of genre-specific methods is kind of a next step in, rather than saying, you know, you can only use these methods to think about all games everywhere, because that's too broad. Yeah.
And one thing, just picking up on what Chris is saying about Twitch streaming as a way to think about the construction of a gamer identity that is not kind of wholly giving agency or subject position. I think it's really interesting how, to me, I've always been interested in games insofar as they construct or interpolate a kind of a kind of, you know, I mean, most obviously in a game like Zork, where the second person is the game player. But the way in which playing the game, part of the goal of playing the game, I think, is to get yourself into the mindset of the you or the player that is attempting to be constructed, and the way that Twitch streams, especially with their kind of individualized portraits, might seem to disrupt that. But I think in a lot of ways, kind of reify it. And also, you know, Henry, I've always found your idea of sort of the narrative architecture of games and thinking about them in terms of amusement park rides as a really, really effective and compelling metaphor in which they are, interdependent, that there isn't really a ride without the rider. But I've found that metaphor to be really, to have a lot of legs and to really continue to have more and more resonances over the years as theme park rides have gotten more and more technologically advanced too.
Well, thank you. So Karen, you want to start giving us some questions from the listeners?
Sure. I just noted in the chat that we did receive a question that privately, but you are also welcome if you, for various reasons, if you do not want to use the chat window, you can also raise your hand and ask a question. There's a little blue hand in the participants section, or you could just indicate a hand raise in the chat. But the first question, was sent for Chris, but I believe it's something that also Tara can tackle as well. And the question is framed around the Asiatic, that the Asiatic itself is very diverse, as you say. But so gaming experiences in India may be different from those in South Korea and Japan. To what extent do you engage this diversity in your book? And also, the person asking the question is interested in how gaming experiences can be rendered subaltern. For example, when Indian gamers do not overtly perceive the Orientalism or can't talk about it. So yeah, I guess the first part of that question is around the range of the Asiatic, the kind of inter-Asian negotiations that we can think about within the realm of the Asiatic. And the second part, more explicitly about the subaltern and how we can describe gaming experiences as subaltern. And any one of you, any of the three of you are free to answer or provide responses.
I think this goes to an interesting place where Tara and I have actually been working on trying to get out a CFP for an edited collection at some point. And the going title is like Made in Asian/America, Why Video Games Were Never About Us, or Were Never For Us. I can't remember. We're still discussing the title. But for the Asiatic, for me, it is a kind of Western way of looking at games. And so like the Asiatic space kind of exists more for Westerners who are kind of projecting that onto games. And as far as when other regions and cultures play them, I don't know, right? I can't really, I've lived in other countries, but I can't really speak so much to that. And so I try to kind of be a bit clear about that in the book. And it is kind of coming from, like with Tara's work as well, as in the kind of that Orientalism discourse, though I see it framed more as a kind of form, a space, or imagined space, rather than a discourse itself, like one that's kind of present even when no one's discussing it or talking about it. And so that's kind of how I think about Asiatic. But we've been thinking about this a lot. I've been thinking about this a lot for this anthology, because it is such a kind of pertinent issue and question, when I think it's like North America takes on about 13% of video game sales, like the market. So many games, even that are kind of designed in the US or published in the US, are actually designed from firms in Europe or Canada or in other countries. It's just, games are just one of those mediums where, you go to a games awards show and things are not in national terms in the way they are in almost every single other awards show that you'll go to. And I find that really fascinating on one hand, but also, and I think a lot of game cultures kind of act as if they're indifferent to where the games are coming from, or perhaps don't even know, what companies are producing what. And there's a lot of game companies, for example, in Japan, that will make games that seem very Western, and then vice versa. And so I think coming from a literary studies background, right, there's a lot of controversy if you're like a student, a PhD student, and you want to write about Japanese novels or novels that were originally written in a different language. There's a lot of controversy. A lot of dissertation advisors may not allow you to graduate, right, if you don't fluently speak that language and understand that culture and context. But game studies is doing it all the time, and I don't see it as really problematic in a sense, because that's exactly what game cultures are and companies are pushing out there. But I think to problematize it is kind of necessary at this point. do you need to understand these things in order to play a Japanese game, or how do you play them differently if you don't, right? So that's what I think the book is kind of interested in, what I'm trying to explore now. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly add on to that. I think it's a really great question, and one that really underscores the importance of kind of regionally specific and global game studies that is recognizing, if not the individual players, certainly how the regional context informs the experience of the game. And, you know, globalization has always been really fascinating to me, starting with Pokemon Go. So how is it kind of adapted and tailored, and how does it kind of lose its foreignness in a way through marketing, very strategic marketing to particular regional contexts? I remember reading about a particular instance, and I'm afraid I can't remember the exact game. I'll try to look it up afterwards. But the marketing team, it was a sort of RPG that also had elements of looting and buying and selling. So there was a virtual currency system. And in localizing it to different Asian countries, there was actually a discovery that certain countries, so it was like, you know, Malaysia versus Singapore versus Thailand, that in early player tests, focus groups on the one hand, in one country, were really interested and happy with the mechanic in which you could pickpocket another player. And that seemed like, you know, a fair and reasonable part of the game, just part of the game. And then one of the other countries found it outrageous, you know, and they were furious about the idea that all of this hard-earned money here could be pickpocketed away, right, by another player. And so when they were localizing and rolling it out to those different markets, they actually, you know, I think it was removed part of that. And who knows, maybe someone on this call is actually someone who wrote about that. That would be wonderful. I know I read it somewhere in this. But it's really interesting to me, and I think important for that, what that question is picking up on about the need to think about how those regional contexts are influencing the games.
And the only thing I'll add here is that, you know, this is something that's of great importance, especially to queer game studies, right? And that's one of the only places that I've actually seen this question discussed, right? And thinking about localization of different types of genders and sexualities that don't necessarily read outside of the game's country of origin, right? And so like Poison is a famous example from the Street Fighter series that's read all like as a sort of transgender-ish or transphobic character in the US, but it's a game that's sort of like produced in Japan. And in my own work, I often think about, you know, my arguments or the things that I write about Bayonetta, right? And Bayonetta as being a game that comes out of Japan, that imagines a sort of like Western, like Catholic world in a particular way. And I don't have that expertise to sort of like speak to the sort of like Japanese cultural influences of that text. And I'd be really interested in people who do to like take up that work and seeing, you know, how they could trouble my own reading of it.
Great. And we actually have two more questions, and we have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to ask both of them. And I apologize for my cat. She would be howling at the door if I kicked her out. Anyway, the first is the question that's made public in the chat from Alice Jim is regarding the BLM question. There's the post-apocalyptic dimension and ways in which BIPOC Afro-Asian futurist world making may be able to imagine the future in a different, better, more socially just place online and IRL. Do your books or ongoing works speak about past and contemporary games that touch upon this, but without going down the post-racial rabbit hole in some way? And the other question, and I'll ask all of you to consider these and see where you want to answer these in the remaining time that we have left. And that is, were there any avenues of thought that didn't make it into the books that you still want to pursue in other projects? So in other words, sort of what were the remainders, and, you know, or what couldn't you just kind of shove into the, you know, the container of these books, and what is going to become something else in the future? So those are the two, and you can each address them in whichever way makes the most sense to any of you.
I can go first, just because those two questions have the same answer for me. because my current work right now is thinking about visual novels made in North America. And visual novels, to me, are kind of one of the most Asiatic, if there's degrees to it, they're probably the most like Asiatic game genres, because a lot of Japanese companies that made them were very protective of them. They didn't want them to go overseas. They felt like this is the Japanese game genre. We're not going to try and sell it elsewhere. Part of that, of course, is because there was so much eroticism and sexuality in it. And in the past 15 or 20 years, thanks to game engines like RinPy and so on, free game engines, there's been a lot of indie designers who are using visual novels, making visual novels, and especially queer, trans people of color are creating amazing visual novels. And a lot of them are really recycling or rehearsing a lot of Japanese and Korean and Chinese myths and figures and things like that for queer and anti-racist purposes. And so I'm trying to kind of work on that like as a utopic space. So I'm trying to think about how visual novels, queer and anti-racist visual novels, that is, are attempting to kind of be aspirational and trying to and by playing them, you kind of move that the horizon of queer utopia a bit more into a different kind of perspective. At the same time, a lot of them, like I had mentioned before, especially by white designers, try to salvage certain parts of Asian culture while saying that other parts are completely bad. So they like separate Asia into two different types, a kind of inorganic machine-like type, and then an organic queer erotic type. And so I try to also be critical of them, even though I think that there's a lot we can get out of playing them. And a lot of, if you're following a lot of Twitter feeds these days, this conversation about what Amanda was saying, visual novels being like a troubled way of playing games, I think is very relevant right now.
Yeah, I will say that some of the remainders or things that got left out of my project is actually independent games where most of that type of more innovative world building is done, right? The mainstream commercial games industry is very conservative, even and especially when they try to diversify the sort of like products that they put out. And I am sort of diving in my next project more headfirst into conversations around necropolitics and death, right? And I was really excited actually to get Chris's book because the erotic is something that is a clear through line in most of the work in Gamer Trouble for me as well. But I'm really excited to see it sort of like expanded into a whole sort of like games methodology in a way, because for me, the erotic and death converge around games in really interesting ways. And so my next project is drawing really heavily, of course, from Black studies and from the sort of like development of necropolitical theory, but while also thinking about how this is all necessarily eroticized, right? So working title right now is like Video Games and the Pornography of Death, and the way that death porn, like not just as a visual spectacle, but as a sort of like affective, emotional thing that we're constantly seeking in many games, I think is an important sort of thing that I'm looking at next.
That sounds like a fantastic project. In terms of the remainder for me, I think a lot of the most contemporary stuff got left out, or there sort of wasn't, it had to constitute a second project because I started in the late 19th century with mine. It just wasn't really possible to responsibly span, I think, such a range. So, one of the ways of answering Alice's question there is, for me, I've been thinking about how esports and competitive video gaming really complicates our ideas about race and Orientalism and gaming, but especially thinking about how kind of Orientalism and anti-Blackness have kind of gone hand in hand is something that I'm interested both in and outside of games. So the other kind of major project that I'm working on is on thinking about Asian American literature of the 70s through this canonical anthology called IE, is how, not in expressly ludic ways, but how ideas of Afro-Asianness or third worldism or Asian and Black coalitions were being built kind of on the ground in ways that are not actually as dissimilar as they may seem from certain gaming scenes. And I'm thinking specifically about like the fighting game genre. And someone like Justin Wong, who had gotten a lot of press, but looking a little bit more into it, and it's still very nascent for me. It's been interesting how, especially a Black and brown community in that early fighting game genre seems to have kind of just been written out, or it's just not as visible in contemporary game studies in a way that seems really important to recenter.
Great. Well, that just about does it for our time today. I want to thank everyone who's come to attend this lovely book talk and book event. And of course, everyone at NYU Press who made it possible. My co-editor, Henry Jenkins, and of course, all three authors, Amanda Phillips, Tara Fickle, Chris Patterson. Please keep in touch with all of us, and please check out all of the books in the Postmillennial Pop series at NYU Press. Also, pay attention to the numerous game studies titles coming out of NYU Press. And if you have any manuscripts and are interested in talking to us about what you're working on, please do reach out. Also, just a couple of quick plugs. One is for Henry's podcast, How Do You Like It So Far? You can find it anywhere you get your podcasts, and my podcast, Waiting to Exhale with Mitchell Werba. One more round of virtual applause and hearts to our presenters. And if you haven't yet, go get their books now. Thank you so very much, everyone, and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.